What if you had to save someone who destroyed your life? This is the story of James, who turned hatred into something no one expected. Stay until the end to see how a single act can change everything. The warm summer breeze swayed the leaves of the trees around the central square as James walked along the sidewalk, holding his books tightly against his chest. He was still a teenager, a slender 17-year-old boy with watchful eyes and a posture that sought to avoid drawing attention. That late afternoon, he tried to cross the square as quickly as possible, eager to get home and escape the gazes of the townsfolk, who always seemed ready to judge. The town was small and close-minded, predominantly white, with an almost unshakable view of how things should be. He felt the weight of others' eyes whenever he walked by, as if every step he took, every word he said, was critically analyzed. James had learned to be discreet, to speak as little as possible, and to lower his gaze whenever he felt the silent hostility. But that afternoon, he couldn't go unnoticed. "Hey, you there?" A harsh voice stopped him in his tracks. Turning around, he saw a group of boys approaching him, laughing and smiling in a way that was less friendly and more threatening. Among them was Tom, a man slightly older than James, known in town for his reputation as the local bad boy. Tom was the type who believed the world owed him something, or maybe he just thought everything around him existed for his entertainment. And now, seeing James there, alone and vulnerable, he had found what he wanted to pass the time. "In a hurry, kids," Tom teased, stepping in front of James, who tried to bypass him without saying anything. "I'm just heading home, man." "Leave me alone," James replied, trying to sound firm. Tom's expression hardened for a moment before he smirked and stepped closer. "And who said you could give orders around here?" Tom advanced, pushing James hard enough to make his books fall from his hands. Scattering them across the ground, James stepped back, trying to suppress the fear spreading through his body like a cold current. He looked around, but there was no one to help him. The square suddenly seemed empty, as if even the sounds of the town had vanished. Looking up, he saw Tom's mocking smile and realized his intentions went beyond mere teasing. "Oh, look at you, thinking you're one of us now, huh?" Tom asked, stepping closer again. "Walking around here like you own the place. It's almost funny." James remained silent, but something inside him screamed to run. Yet, his feet felt glued to the ground as the group's laughter echoed around him. They circled him, forming a semicircle that trapped him in place. Tom's friends murmured words of encouragement, their smiles more akin to spectators at a cruel show. "Say something, kid," Tom demanded, crossing his arms as if genuinely expecting a response. James took a deep breath and said firmly, "I just want to pass." But that phrase seemed to provoke the group even more. Before he could react, Tom stepped forward and punched him in the stomach. The pain was instant, burning like fire, and James doubled over, trying to catch his breath. Looking up, he saw Tom smiling with satisfaction. Before he could defend himself, another punch landed, followed by a kick and more shoves. James tried to protect himself, raising his arms to block the blows, but he felt powerless. Each punch carried a clear message, a reminder that he wasn't welcome there, that he never would be. Every word that came out of Tom and his friends' mouths carried a violence deeper than the physical hits. It was a declaration of hate, of exclusion. "Go back to where you belong, kid," Tom whispered as he kicked him again. "You'll never have a place here. Never." When the group finally grew tired, they left him on the ground, his body aching and his mind reeling. James lay there for a few moments, feeling the weight of the ground against his back as he tried to process what had just happened. He knew he had to get up, to leave, but the pain kept him paralyzed. He closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. After a few minutes, he finally gathered the strength to stand. The marks of the attack were there, the scratches, the bruises slowly appearing, and the intense pain in his chest and arms. But more than that, he knew he would carry the weight of that humiliation for a long time. Tom's words echoed in his mind, an unrelenting reminder of what he represented to some people there. In the days that followed, James kept silent about what had happened. Slowly, he let the physical pain subside, and the marks on his body began to fade. But deep inside, he knew that episode had scarred his soul. He never reported Tom, never told his parents or friends what had happened. He decided no one needed to know. After all, what would it change? The town was what it was, and he knew he could never change it on his own. From that moment, James began to withdraw. He avoided speaking much about himself, preferring anonymity. Deep down, he felt that no matter how hard he tried to prove himself, how much he worked or behaved impeccably, there would always be those who looked at him as an intruder, a stranger. Summer passed, and he focused on his studies and work, trying to build a life that would one day take him far away from there. But no matter how much he tried to move on, that afternoon in the square continued to haunt him. He remembered the looks, the punches, the laughter that made him feel small, humiliated. And on some nights, he would wake suddenly, his heart racing, reliving the attack in his dreams. He tried not to think about Tom, but his face would appear in James's mind when he least expected it, a lingering reminder of everything he wanted to forget. In that town, James became known as a hard-working and honest man. People began to respect him, though inside he knew it didn't erase the weight of his memories. He had learned to control his expressions, to measure his words, and to act restrained, even when facing subtle discrimination and provocations in daily life. Now, years later, as he crossed the same square, James looked around and saw children playing, families sitting on benches and the tranquility of the scene. But for him, that place would always carry a different meaning. It was there he had lost part of his innocence, where he had learned what hate was. And for a moment, he wondered how he would react if he ever saw Tom again. As the years went by, James transformed into what the town often referred to as a good worker. He woke up early, walked to the bus stop, and headed to his job at a small mechanic shop about 5 kilometers from downtown. The owner, an older man named Ben, was one of the few who genuinely seemed to trust and value his work. But even there, James knew he had to tread carefully. One day, while cleaning tools and organizing the inventory, he overheard 2 customers talking near the entrance. Their voices were low, but James could clearly hear the tone of disdain in one of them. "Have you seen who Ben hired?" "That kid, James. Always so quiet, a little odd. Who knows what he's thinking?" one said, almost as if unaware that James was just on the other side of the door. The other customer chuckled. "Yeah, but I guess he doesn't bother anyone. And really, it's probably the only kind of job someone like him could get, right?" James froze for a moment, holding his breath as their words echoed in his mind. He was used to being underestimated and judged, but hearing it so blatantly still stung. He gripped the rag he was using to clean the tools tightly, trying to ignore the growing anger inside him. A few minutes later, Ben walked into the room, noticing James's tense face. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his tone curious. James forced a smile. "Yes, sir. Just distracted." Ben studied him for a moment before giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Don't mind what others say, James. Work hard, and that's all that matters. You're good at what you do." Those words, though simple, brought James some relief. Ben always treated him with respect and encouraged him to keep going. For James, that was enough. He had a stable job, a roof over his head, and though life was hard, he managed to endure. But the town's hostility continued to find ways to manifest, and he knew he had to stay strong. Over time, he learned to face these challenges almost automatically. When he crossed paths with acquaintances who avoided his gaze, he simply kept walking. When he heard whispers and laughter behind his back, he tried to think about something else. Even at the shop, when customers looked at him with that mix of distrust and superiority, he focused on his work and let his skills speak for themselves. A few months later, an incident tested his resilience even further. One day, an older woman named Nancy arrived at the shop with a problem in her car, and Ben asked James to take a look. James did his part, finding the issue and explaining what needed to be done. However, as soon as he finished, Nancy raised her eyebrows as if he had said something absurd. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Ben to confirm what James had just said. Ben, who had been listening, stepped closer. "James knows what he's doing, Nancy. He's one of the best I've had working with me," he said firmly. Nancy scoffed and gave James a cold look before responding to Ben. "Well, I don't know, Ben. Sometimes it's hard to trust, you know. But if you vouch for him, so be it." James pretended not to hear the insinuation, though he felt his face grow warm. He simply thanked Ben for his support, knowing that any response could be misinterpreted. Over the years, interactions like this became common. James knew he had to be twice as good, work twice as hard, and avoid any mistakes that could be used against him. To those watching from a distance, he was an example of patience and resilience, a man who never complained, who always accepted whatever came his way. At night, at home, he often reflected on what kept him there. Sometimes, he thought about leaving it all behind, finding a new town where no one knew his name, where he might finally feel at ease. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the fear that everything would repeat itself elsewhere, or, maybe, a part of him that refused to be defeated. One day, after a long shift at work, he returned home to find his brother, Thomas, waiting for him on the porch. Thomas was one of the few people James felt comfortable talking to. Seeing him, James forced a tired smile. "Everything all right, Thomas?" he asked as he climbed the steps. Thomas looked at him, not responding immediately, as if choosing his words carefully. "Yeah, everything's fine. I just wanted to check on you." James sighed, realizing the question wasn't casual. Thomas knew well the weight James carried. "You know how it is, Thomas. Every day brings its own challenges. But I'm surviving." Thomas nodded, looking thoughtful. "Have you ever thought about leaving here?" The question caught James off guard. "I have, many times. But what about you? Do you think it would be any different somewhere else?" Thomas hesitated before answering. "I think it's worth trying, you know. Sometimes, all we need is a fresh start." James looked at the ground, absorbing his brother's words. In part, he knew Thomas was right, but at the same time, something inside him resisted giving up. He wanted to prove that, despite everything, he could build something there, in a place where so many saw him as a stranger. It felt like he was in a silent battle, an undeclared war against the prejudice surrounding him. Seeing James's serious expression, Thomas simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you, brother." James nodded, grateful for the support. "I know, Thomas. Thank you." That conversation with his brother brought James a renewed, though quiet, determination. He knew that life there would remain full of challenges, but in a way, he felt he still had something to prove, not to others, but to himself. After all, he knew his strength wasn't just in enduring hardships, but in continuing to rise again. The next day, he returned to work at the shop as usual, focused on his tasks and ignoring the looks of disapproval. For every client who eyed him with distrust, he responded with hard work. For every rude comment, he responded with quiet determination. He knew people would continue to expect him to fail, but he was determined to surprise them, even if it cost him his pride. Over time, the routine interactions at the shop became a constant test of patience and perseverance. And as each day passed, James reinforced to himself that he wasn't there to please anyone. He was there to build something only he could understand. The afternoon sun bathed the town in a golden hue as James, exhausted from an intense day at the shop, made his way home. He walked slowly, lost in thought, reflecting on the past few weeks. The harsh words and disdainful looks had become part of his routine, but even so, the emotional toll continued to build. The town seemed determined to remind him of his place, as if acceptance and respect were privileges reserved for others. As he walked through the streets, the sun disappeared behind the buildings, and the empty sidewalk emitted an unusual calm. It was rare for James to walk home, but that day he felt he needed time alone to organize his thoughts. He thought about the conversation with his brother, Thomas, and the lingering desire to perhaps, someday, leave it all behind. The town, which he knew like the back of his hand, always felt indifferent, an unchanging backdrop to his daily struggles. However, as he turned a corner near the old market, he noticed something strange. A car was parked haphazardly on the sidewalk, its doors open, and a man lay sprawled beside it, motionless. Approaching closer, James realized something was wrong. The man appeared unconscious, with a bottle lying beside him, hinting at possible drunkenness. He hesitated, feeling the weight of a dilemma forming within him. Taking a few more steps, he then recognized the man lying on the ground, Tom. The same icy sensation coursed through his body. Time seemed to stop, and James stood there motionless, staring at the man who, years ago, had so brutally marked his life. His mind transported him back to that afternoon in the square, to the harsh words, the punches, and the kicks. He could hear Tom's voice echoing in his memory, filled with hatred and contempt. "You'll never have a place here." James took a deep breath, his heart pounding. A part of him, the part that carried the wounds of the past, wanted to simply walk away, to leave Tom there to face the consequences of his own actions. After all, why should he help someone who had treated him with such cruelty? Someone responsible for so many years of pain and humiliation? Yet, another part of him urged him to act. Tom was visibly unwell, and though James could easily turn his back and ignore the situation, something inside him resisted the idea. It wasn't forgiveness, nor a desire for revenge. Perhaps it was a matter of principles, of values he had cultivated that prevented him from becoming bitter and filled with hate. James took a deep breath, kneeling to examine Tom more closely. He noticed that Tom had a head injury, likely from an awkward fall. The empty bottle beside him indicated he had drunk too much and was now paying the price for his recklessness. However, it was clear the injury was serious and required medical attention. "Damn it, Tom," he muttered, more to himself, debating what to do. He still held his phone in his hand, internally wrestling with the decision. The idea of calling for help for a man who had caused him so much pain seemed absurd, but in the end, instinct won. He dialed emergency services and reported the situation in a calm tone, without mentioning that he knew Tom or their history. After the call, he remained by Tom's side, waiting for the ambulance to arrive, trying to ignore the torrent of emotions churning in his mind. The minutes dragged on, and James watched Tom, now unconscious, with a serious and almost neutral expression. He tried to recall a single moment when Tom had spoken to him without disdain, but couldn't. Why should he help? The question haunted him. But he knew the answer lay in his own nature, not in who Tom was or had been. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics quickly got out, taking control of the situation. One of them, a woman with a stern face and swift movements, approached James. "Are you the one who found him here?" she asked while examining Tom's injury. "Yes, I was passing by and saw him on the ground," James replied simply. The paramedic nodded in acknowledgement and continued her work. James watched the commotion, still dazed by how quickly everything had happened. He felt a mix of relief and inner conflict, but above all, he knew the incident would force him to confront emotions he had tried to bury for years. As the paramedics placed Tom on a stretcher and prepared him for transport, James turned to leave. But before he could take his first step, he heard the paramedic's voice again. "If it weren't for you, he might have been here for hours," she said with a slight nod, as if acknowledging the importance of what he had done. James simply nodded back, not responding, and walked away. As he distanced himself from the scene, a whirlwind of thoughts flooded his mind. The image of Tom lying there, vulnerable, was etched in his memory, and he knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. The walk home was quiet, and James reflected on his choice. He didn't regret it, but neither did he feel at peace. The moral dilemma lingered, a reminder that while he had done what he believed was right, it didn't erase the past. After all, the hatred Tom had harbored was still a reality James had to contend with. When he arrived home, James sat at the small kitchen table, trying to organize his thoughts. Helping Tom had been a reflection of the values he had cultivated over the years, but he knew the emotional wounds were still open, on some level. He had hoped that by helping, he would feel some sense of satisfaction or lightness, but that wasn't the case. There was only a void, a reminder that the past was still present and painful. As the night went on, he found himself questioning his choices, reevaluating what that gesture truly meant for him. Perhaps, he thought, he was closer to forgiveness than he realized. Not for Tom, but for himself, to lighten the burden he had carried for so long. The morning air was cold, and silence filled the hospital as James walked down the sterile, white corridor. He hesitated for a moment before stopping in front of the room where Tom was admitted. Since the incident, James's conscience hadn't given him any rest. After days of reflection, he decided that, to move forward, he needed to confront Tom, even if just to understand the reason behind all the hatred and contempt he had shown in the past. James knew what he was about to do was risky. There was a good chance he'd leave with even more questions and without the peace he hoped to find. But deep down, something compelled him, a force he couldn't ignore. It was as if, by revisiting the person who had been the epicenter of his trauma, he was ready to close that chapter once and for all. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Tom lay on the bed, his face pale and his eyes half open, focused on a fixed point on the ceiling. When he noticed someone's presence, he turned slowly, and upon seeing James, his expression hardened. A mix of surprise and discomfort flashed across his face. James took a few steps into the room, stopping beside the bed, without looking away. "I won't stay long," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I thought it was right to come here." Tom remained silent, his eyes tense, as if the mere act of having James there was a difficult weight to bear. For a few moments, silence filled the room, until Tom finally let out a heavy sigh. "You didn't have to do that," Tom murmured, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. James didn't reply immediately. He studied Tom, observing every expression, every detail that might give him a clue about what the other man truly felt. "I did it because I couldn't leave someone in that situation, even if that someone was you." Tom looked away, embarrassed, but said nothing. His eyes revealed a mix of guilt and resentment he seemed to be trying to hide. James noticed this, but decided to press on. "Years ago, you left me on the ground like I was nothing, like I had no value," James said, trying to keep his voice steady, but unable to hide the pain he still carried. Tom turned back to face him, his eyes now darker. "You think I don't know that?" he replied defensively. "You think I don't remember? I do." James remained silent, waiting for him to continue. He felt that in some way, this was the first time Tom was truly opening up, albeit hesitantly. "I was an idiot," Tom admitted with a bitter laugh. "I thought I needed to prove something. I don't know. Maybe it was the only way I thought I could earn respect. But I was just a coward, someone who couldn't deal with what I saw in the mirror." "Then why?" James asked, not hiding the pain in his voice. "Why choose me to be your target?" Tom looked away again, his expression tired, almost defeated. He took a deep breath before answering. "Because you were everything I couldn't be. You had a strength I envied, something I never understood. And at the same time, it was easy to blame you. You were different, and I thought that if I kept you down, maybe I could rise." Tom's confession seemed to strip away a layer of his pride, and James could see the sincerity in his words. Though the pain still lingered, he felt a new understanding forming, as if he could finally see Tom not as a monster, but as a flawed and regretful person. James took a deep breath, trying to process what he had just heard. He felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and perhaps a strange sense of empathy. He had never imagined that Tom would open up like this, that he would admit to feeling something akin to regret. "I spent years trying to figure out what was wrong with me," James said, his voice low and controlled. Because of you, because of what you and the others did. And it was always a battle within myself. But now I realize it was never about me. It was about you and your insecurities. Tom closed his eyes, as if James's words had hit him with force. He seemed vulnerable, a shadow of the arrogant, ruthless person James had known in his youth. That man now was just someone broken, consumed by his own regrets. After a long silence, Tom finally spoke, his voice almost inaudible. I can't change what I did, James. I know I can't. But what you did for me, it changes everything. You had every reason to leave me there, but you chose not to. I don't know what to say except, I'm sorry. James felt the weight of the apology. For years, he had longed to hear those words. But now that they were there, they felt emptier than he had expected. After all, they couldn't erase years of pain and humiliation. Still, he knew forgiveness wasn't for Tom. It was for himself. Perhaps it was the only way to finally free himself from that past. I don't need your apology, James said, looking directly into Tom's eyes. I need to move forward, and maybe you need to as well. Tom nodded slowly, as if James's words struck something deep within him. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, unable to find the right words. James, for his part, felt an unexpected calm. The anger and resentment seemed to be dissipating, giving way to a strange peace. James stood, ready to leave the room. As he walked toward the door, he heard Tom's voice again, softer this time, almost hesitant. James, I really am sorry. James paused for a moment, but didn't turn around. Take care, Tom, he replied, his voice carrying a note of finality. As he left the room, James felt as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew forgiveness wasn't an easy path, but in that moment, he felt he finally had the power to leave the past behind. Walking down the hospital corridor, James realized that the experience had changed him. He had chosen not to return hate with hate, not to let resentment consume him. He was now someone who, even in the face of pain, had chosen a different path, a path that, though difficult, brought him a quiet peace. The fresh air outside the hospital brought James a sense of relief he hadn't felt in years. As he stepped through the doors, it was as if he had finally left behind an invisible burden, an emotional weight that had followed him since that fateful afternoon in the square. The decision to forgive Tom, even though it didn't erase the past, had created something within him, a kind of peace, a relief he had never thought possible. James walked back home, feeling a newfound lightness. Each step seemed to lift him out of an old shadow, and for the first time he allowed himself to look at the town with new eyes. The familiar streets, which once felt suffocating and oppressive, now carried a different atmosphere, as if the weight of the past was slowly dissipating. In the days that followed, the story of how he had helped Tom began to spread. The rumors started subtly, but soon everyone seemed to know. People in the community who had previously ignored him began to give him curious glances and perhaps even looks of respect. James knew those stares carried a mix of surprise and incomprehension. After all, how could someone who had been treated with such contempt choose to help his aggressor? Yet he no longer cared. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that others' opinions could no longer define who he was. He had found strength within himself and was now ready to move forward without needing anyone's approval or recognition. Time passed, and James continued with his routine, keeping his job at the shop and leading a simple life. Despite everything, he never spoke about what had happened with Tom or about the visit to the hospital. For him, forgiveness and inner peace were personal achievements that didn't need to be displayed. However, the change in James was noticeable to those around him, especially to his brother, Thomas. One evening, as the two sat on the porch, gazing at the starry sky, Thomas turned to him with a curious expression. "You seem different," Thomas remarked, his voice light. "Like you've let go of a weight." James smiled, his gaze fixed on the stars. "I think I finally found what I was looking for, Thomas. Something that's been with me all along, but I couldn't see it." Thomas observed him silently, understanding what his brother meant without needing many words. He had always known James carried an invisible burden, and now, seeing his brother at peace was a satisfaction he couldn't explain. "I'm proud of you, James," Thomas said with a sincere smile. "You did something few would have the courage to do." James simply nodded, his expression serene. He didn't need more words to know his brother understood. That night was the first of many where he finally felt at ease, free from the weight of the past that had once held him back. Over time, James's attitude began to inspire subtle changes within the community. People, though hesitant, started questioning their own actions and prejudices. The story of how he had helped Tom, someone who had treated him with such cruelty, became a symbol of empathy and strength. One day, while James was working in the shop, a customer, a middle-aged man named Henry, approached him after a service with a serious expression. "James, I heard about what you did," Henry said, his voice low and a bit hesitant. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. I never thought someone could have that kind of greatness." James looked at him with a modest smile. "It was the right thing to do." Henry nodded, clearly moved. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry if I've ever done anything to disrespect you. I don't want to be the kind of person who adds to that anymore." James was slightly surprised by Henry's words. He had always known him as someone who avoided deep interactions and maintained a cold, distant demeanor. What he hadn't expected was that the change in his own life could inspire others to reflect on their actions. Over time, similar interactions began to occur. Small gestures of respect, discreet apologies, and even words of gratitude from people who had previously ignored his presence. James never imagined that the simple act of forgiving Tom could create a ripple of transformation, even if slow, in a town he had always thought unchangeable. Years later, James's life remained simple but marked by a sense of fulfillment. He decided to move forward, continuing the work he loved and dedicating himself to helping others, especially young people who, like him, faced challenges of acceptance and respect. He began offering small workshops at the shop, teaching mechanics to teenagers in the community and providing an opportunity for them to develop skills and find a positive path. The young people admired him. To them, James was more than a mechanic. He was an example of perseverance and dignity. And James felt that, by sharing his knowledge, he was also passing on the values he had learned over the years: perseverance, respect, and empathy. One day, while he was working with one of the young apprentices, he heard a woman's voice as she entered the shop. Turning around, he saw a middle-aged woman with a tired appearance, but a determined gleam in her eyes. "James?" she asked, approaching. "My name is Sarah. I'm Tom's sister." James observed her silently, unsure of what to expect from the conversation. He hadn't seen Tom since his visit to the hospital and knew little about what had happened to him afterward. Sarah's presence there was unexpected. "My brother talked a lot about you before he passed," Sarah said, with a sad expression. "He said what you did for him changed him, and that he spent his last years trying to be a better person." James took a deep breath, processing her words. He had never imagined that his choice to forgive Tom would have impacted his life so deeply. Sarah continued, "I just wanted to thank you, James. Even after everything that happened, you chose to do the right thing. And that changed his life, and mine too." James nodded, speechless, as Sarah hugged him briefly before saying goodbye and leaving the shop. He stood there for a few moments, absorbing her message and feeling a quiet gratitude. The choice he had made years ago had closed a cycle, not just for him, but for many others as well. That evening, as James walked through the square where it had all begun, he allowed himself to look back and reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. He now realized that forgiveness and overcoming weren't just isolated acts, but daily choices that shaped a person's path. By helping Tom, he had discovered that often it was necessary to challenge one's own expectations to find the right way forward. As he crossed the square, he passed by the exact spot where, years ago, he had been humiliated. But now, that place held a new meaning. It was no longer a scene of pain, but one of redemption and growth. James knew that the emotional scars he had carried for so long were now part of who he was, but in a different way, as reminders of a battle won. Looking up at the stars, he smiled. For a long time, he had believed the weight of the past would never leave him. But now he understood that true freedom came from forgiveness. James had become living proof that it was possible to transform hate into compassion, and with that, he inspired everyone around him. For him, this was the greatest achievement, to know that by choosing empathy, he not only freed himself but also offered others a chance for change. How far would you go to find the strength to help someone who hurt you? Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.